evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think we are now looking forward to hear Professor Norman who came from Stanford to us and to our conference. I'm really happy that he has followed our invitation. And I don't think it's really necessary to present him very long, because as you have come to this conference, most of you have already read one of his books. He's one of the decent historians dealing with the modern Eastern European history. He has written especially many books on genocide, which are really, these works who everybody has to read who is dealing with this issue. Norman was so kind to come and to share his views on the issues we are today discussing. We have now time for his speech, for his keynote, and then for debate. And afterwards we will have also an opportunity to discuss it later during the dinner. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you. It's nice to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Andre. I appreciate it. It's nice to be in Prague. It's nice to be at the conference today, and I learned a lot. In fact, I should change a few things in this talk after what I heard today. But then I thought, well, I'll wait till tomorrow, because there'll be more to change after that. I've also changed the title of the talk. When I wrote it about a week or 10 days ago, was after I sent you the old title. You always do that. You kind of make up a title and then you say, oh, geez, what am I going to do? And I just decided to change the title and write what I wanted to write about. And that is what I've called now Violence in the Interregnum, 1944 to 1947, which is more directly relevant, actually, to what we were talking about today than the other title. The Oxford Dictionary defines interregnum as the time between the reigns of monarchs, referring to the 16th century gaps created by the rule of regencies in England and to the history of the Holy Roman Empire, between the crowning of the emperors. In this talk, by interregnum, I have in mind the period between the retreat of the Nazis and their allies from various parts of Europe, which generally can be dated from 1944, to the establishment of the new order that took until late 1947, early 1948 in some parts of the continent. The interregnum overlaps with the transition from war to peace, which is itself hard to date precisely because of the continuation of the fighting into the post-war period. In order to come to terms with the interregnum as a time of ongoing violence, one has to start with the war itself, although then go on to discuss the character of violence, the role of state structures, the place of retribution and vengeance taking, and end with talking about the special post-war victimhood of both women, which we talked about today, and Jews, who we did not talk about. World War II was the most violent war in modern European history. It took the most lives, between 40 and 60 million. It's amazing how still an argument about numbers. It saw the displacement of roughly 40 million people. The boundaries between civilian and military victims all but disappeared. Its unprecedented application of modern military technology, from otherworldly tank battles and incendiary bombing of urban centers to the use of atomic weapons and V-2 rockets, shook the soul of mankind. The war on the Eastern Front in particular was brutal beyond imagination. Overlaid with the Holocaust, which sometimes occurred in the very same locations as many of the most fearsome battles of the war, the Eastern Front assumed the visage of the apocalypse, with its four horsemen, famine, war, pestilence, and death leading the way. Despite the formal German surrender on May 8th or May 9th to the Soviets, the horsemen continued to trample the European landscape. Europe was not just a devastated continent after the war ended, writes Ian Kershaw, it was a wild continent, end of quote. In its sheer explosiveness, the Second World War unleashed a series of wars within the war that did not end in 1945. There were fierce civil wars fought between left and right. The Spanish Civil War, which predated World War II, can nevertheless be thought of as the first civil war unleashed by Nazi and fascist aggression, killing roughly 500,000 people on each side. The last civil wars associated with World War II went on in liberated Poland and in the Baltic countries, where fierce internecine battles were fought between the new communist authorities and the anti-communist resistance forces late into the 1940s, and even as we heard today in the 1950s. After the south of Italy was liberated by the Allies, Italian partisans, led by the communists, fought Mussolini, the Germans, and the Salo Republic, losing altogether an estimated 50,000 of their ranks. The end of the war saw the slaughter go on, as Italian communist partisans massacred alleged fascist groups and murdered Mussolini and his mistress, hanging them by the heels in Milan. The post-war toll in victims of the Italian partisans, depending on the source, was somewhere between 12,000 and 20,000. The bitter and violent Greek Civil War, which went on into the late 1940s, only to be halted in good measure as a consequence of Stalin's utter indifference to support to the Greek communists, might be thought of as one of the last World War II civil wars. As Stathis Kalivas explains about Greece, frequently civil war is less about large ideological conflicts, though they certainly matter, than about local squabbles, being played out in life and death scenarios, in family, clan, and village rivalries. Civil wars, and the Greek case was no exception, as we know from today, given the heavy involvement of Macedonians in the Elis, frequently were intertwined with nationalist rivalries. Ethnic wars continued to plague Eastern Europe, in particular in the post-war period. The fighting between Poles and Ukrainians in Volhynia and Eastern Galicia in 1943, whose origins were framed already in the late 1930s by Polish-Ukrainian conflict in the Kresy, spilled over in 44 and 45 into post-war Polish campaigns against Ukrainians in Operation Wisła, which saw the Ukrainian population removed from southeastern Poland and distributed throughout the so-called recovered territories for the purposes of mass assimilation. UPA attacks in Ukraine on Poles, not to mention on the Soviets in the years following the war, continued the bloodshed. Operation Wisła cost some 5,500 Ukrainian lives, while the Polish-Ukrainian fighting and massacres may have taken as many as 100,000 lives on each side. During the same period, over 2 million Poles were forcibly deported from the Soviet Union to Poland, while 480,000 Ukrainians were deported from Poland to the Soviet Union. From the Soviet Union to Poland, and Ukrainians from Poland to the Soviet Union. There were also wars of territorial acquisition during World War II that ricocheted off the Germans' own ambitions that had initiated the war. Hungarians and Romanians sought gains versus each other all through the Second World War. Romanians and Hungarians were constantly planning to attack each other. The Romanians sought territory from the Soviets in Transnistria and Bessarabia. The Poles annexed lands from the Czechoslovaks in the Teschen region as a consequence of Munich, and were able to regain them after the war, though not without violent border clashes. Hungarians looked to absorb territory in Transcarpathia that they had seized, killing large numbers of Jews in the process. Croats sought to rule what had been primarily Serbian territory, also engaging in murderous attacks on Serbian and Muslim communities in the process. Transfers of territory, as Holly Case has pointed out, frequently boded ill for the local Jewish population, which were no longer protected by institutionalized arrangements with their previous rulers. The Yugoslav partisans' attacks on Italians in Venetia Giulia, Dalmatia, and Istria, the so-called Foiba massacres, because the bodies, anywhere from several thousand to 20,000, were thrown into the Foiba, these karst crevices throughout the region. also fits this pattern. Carried out ostensibly in retribution against Italian fascist depredations, the Foiba massacres were also intended to aid the seizure of territory for the new expansionist Yugoslav communist state and put additional pressure on Trieste. Here, ethnic cleansing literally bled into mass murder as some 200,000 Italians fled the partisan campaign of terror and intimidation. Retribution, together with territorial aspirations, was also at the heart of the brutal Yugoslav partisan massacres of some 12,000 members of the Slovene Home Guard at Domobranci, not to mention tens of thousands of Croatian Ustaša and other alleged collaborators. Add to these killings the fierce Yugoslav partisan treatment of the Donauschwaben, many of whom expired in detention camps in the Vojvodina, then there's good reason to suggest that the Yugoslav experience with post-war violence, as one scholar has written, was unparalleled anywhere else in Europe. To say that's a competition, which is open. I mean, whether it's Greece, whether it's Ukraine, whether it's Poland, whether it's Yugoslavia, there's a real competition for the most violence in Europe. Given the forced deportation of Germans from Eastern Europe, Hungarians from Ukraine and Slovakia, Poles from the Soviet Union, Italians and Germans from Yugoslavia, Germans from Denmark, Ukrainians from Poland, and so on and so forth, it's worth pausing for a minute to evaluate the violence that accompanies these processes. Even the adjective forced does not quite capture the essential fact that removing people from their homes, villages, and native realms, to use Czesław Miłosz's term, is both explicitly violent, meaning people are variously beaten, hurt, dragged, threatened, injured, shot, raped, and murdered in order to get them to leave, and implicitly violent, meaning that the simple fact of removing people from their homes does enormous damage to their sense of belonging, understanding, family, community life, and profession or occupation. Both kinds of violence can be profoundly traumatic. It's not apparent to me why a good portion of the recent historiography of forced migration, from the Balkan Wars in 1912-13 to the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s, and much of it concentrated, by the way, on World War II and the aftermath, underplays, underanalyzes, and undertheorizes the level and types of violence involved. The goal of scholarship is to put violence in context and understand why it happens. But sometimes in the process of abstraction and generalization, the grim realities experienced by young and old, men and women, children and old folk, get lost in the needs of scholarship to grapple with larger causes and effects. The study of emotions should also play an important role in understanding the violence that pervaded Europe after the war. The hatred, resentments, and fear, categories that sociologist Vladimir Peterson uses when he talks about violence in Europe, that the Nazi aggression and occupation unleashed throughout Europe could not be so simply brought to an end by unconditional surrender. Perhaps even more than the lives eliminated and the peoples physically injured and abused under Nazi occupation, the humiliation of losing sovereignty to the Germans aroused intense resentments and feelings of retribution towards German men, women, children, and old folk. It's hard to posit a direct relationship between the extent of German repression against individual nations to the extent of retributive violence directed against Germans who remained in these countries after the war. But it's no accident, of course, that the Poles exacted extreme vengeance against the 5 or 6 million Germans who had remained in the newly reconstituted Poland. One could argue that the vengeance exacted by the Czechs against the almost 3.5 million Germans remaining in the country was no less brutal than in Poland, even though the occupation was less repressive and the resistance against the occupation less inflamed. Tomasz Stanek notes that between 24,000 and 50,000 Germans died as a result of their treatment in post-war Czechoslovakia. Again, one of these numbers that's extremely difficult to establish, with another 100,000 in prison. Certainly a good number of those in turn died as a result of hunger, abuse, and disease. Taking revenge served as a form of catharsis for those who had suffered during the war. But it was also linked to the psychological reversal of the powerlessness that was frequently part of the reality of the occupied. The role of the unmaking and making of states in the region provided further cause for violence. As the Nazi empire began to recede, it left a vacuum that could not be filled immediately by existing state structures, especially in East Central and Southeastern Europe, where Nazi allies and dependencies fell quickly by the wayside, and Soviet armies, local communists, and democratic-oriented forces tried to take their place. The interregnum then proved particularly susceptible to social and ethnic violence, where the authorities, to the extent that they actually functioned, could do little to control the murderous tensions unleashed by the war. The structures of the state were only slowly rebuilt after the war, especially in those countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and the Baltic countries that were destroyed or broken up by the Nazis. One of the most violent of these areas, and again there's a good competition for this award, was no doubt the so-called recovered territories, Ziemie odzyskane of Poland, which was called the Wild West for good reason. There were Soviet soldiers stationed in large numbers in the region, though not formally in occupation, and seeking primarily to supply their military and remove German machinery and goods, as well as Germans themselves, back to the Soviet Union. The Soviet military tended to criticize the violence perpetrated by the Germans, against the Germans by the Poles as disruptive and even as inhuman, but generally stood aside from the rampage unless it directly countered their interests. The area was plagued by the so-called Schaberowcy, from the German Schabernack, looters who came predominantly from central Poland to seize German property from the dispossessed and evacuating Germans. Communist leader Bolesław Drobner estimated that 60% of the Poles who came to Breslau, in 1945 came to loot and steal. With meager gendarme forces, a tiny party organization, a corrupt and frequently drunken secret police operation, the UB, that's courtesy of Mali, right? And inept factory committees that had trouble keeping the looters out of the enterprises, it was virtually impossible to maintain order. One factory director stated, and I quote, that quote, "The mad desire to grab someone else's abandoned property is beyond all means of control," end of quote. But I would add to that, not just property that was abandoned, but property that was also lived in and worked in by Germans. It was no coincidence that the end of the separate administration of the recovered territories coincided with the removal of Władysław Gomułka from power in 1948 and the Stalinization of the Polish government. Retribution, not just against Germans, but against collaborators, or alleged collaborators, was also a major part of the post-war story of violence and killing, told well, in my view, by Istvan Deák, Jan Gross, and Tony Judd in their books and articles. To repeat, there appears to be no one-to-one relationship between the actual suffering of the victims and the brutality of those who sought vengeance. In France and Italy, for example, partisans were involved in a bitter struggle against the occupiers and collaborators. But the level of violent retribution was much higher after the war than in Norway or Holland, where there was a quite remarkable quick healing of societal anger. This is comparatively, of course, despite similarly aggravated relations between collaborationist authorities and resistance fighters. We note from today as well, in Norway there was an unusually thoroughgoing judicial purge of collaborationists. Some 90,000 were tried after the war, 4% of the population. The Norwegians also famously, we heard this today too, denied citizenship to thousands of so-called half-breed offspring of German soldiers and Norwegian women. But there was nowhere near the number of lynchings, beatings, and killing that plagued France and Italy after the war. Prompt state action made the difference. The Nobel Prize-winning novelist J.M. Coetzee writes, "Vengeance," and I quote, "vengeance is like a fire. The more it devours, the hungrier it gets," end of quote. But I would add to his observation that the fire eventually burns out, that vengeance has its limits and can be contained, as it was by the newly constituted authorities in both Eastern and Western Europe. At first, the fires were so hot, the police stood by the wayside and even participated in the violence. But the need of the new post-war states to exert a monopoly on violence, using the Weberian definition of the state, quickly made it apparent that there was more to lose by allowing roaming bands of vengeance takers, former POWs, former slave laborers, pillagers of various origins, groups of former partisans, armed posses, to take control of the social landscape. Charles de Gaulle stated in a radio address on his return to Paris in August 1944 that, and I quote, "absolutely all improvised authorities must stop," end of quote. Part of the transition from post-war new democracies, as defined by Stalin and European communists as progressive, Soviet-friendly, parliamentary democracies, to Stalin's people's democracies as they emerged in 1948 and 49, entailed the professionalization of secret police and gendarme forces, which in the immediate post-war period were generally haphazardly organized and frequently corrupt. This was in contrast to local police and carabinieri forces in Italy that, given their continuities with the fascist regime, were able, for the most part, to control the periodic bloody outbursts of peasant and worker violence in Italy in the post-war period. One could add that the reassertion of state control was aided by a societal proclivity toward what Tony Judd has called collective amnesia after the war, which was not just a psychological process, but one that served the immediate self-interests of former Nazis, fascists, collaborators, and perpetrators of various sorts, which we talked about this afternoon. One might have thought that there would have been more attempts to seek retribution against the former Nazi rulers and their countless collaborators in Germany by persecuted German communists and social democrats, among others, who suffered at the hands of the Nazi regime. But there was relatively little post-war civil violence in Germany or Austria. In good measure, because almost every German had been involved in some point or another in the so-called Volksgemeinschaft that the Nazis had successfully propagandized during the war. It was almost impossible after the war to find a German or Austrian who admitted to Nazi sympathies during the war. It was equally remarkable that a form of social national solidarity precluded much in the way of settling of scores. The presence of Allied occupation authorities in Germany and Austria also inhibited the potential for violent retribution. There's a new study by Andrew Beatty, which I just read on the plane coming to Prague, in which he demonstrates that close to 400,000 Germans were locked up by the various Allied authorities right after the war. And clearly that had something to do more or less with the same way the Norwegians then dealt with collaborators right away in judicial trials, to keep retribution from taking a societal form. The most flagrant internal German and Austrian resentments were played out, interestingly enough, against the 12 million or so Germans who were driven out of Eastern Europe and sought shelter, work, and safety in German and Austrian lands. Here, they were greeted with anger, resentment, and violence by local Germans, who were unable and unwilling to share space, food, and employment with them. Now, for the remainder of the talk, I'd like to focus on two groups that were particular victims of post-war violence, and that is women and Jews. Unlike the victimhood of the Germans at the end of the war and the beginning of the peace, clearly these two groups were not at all perpetrators or oppressors, though of course there were many female collaborators of various nationalities. And as demonstrated by Wendy Lower's book, Nazi Furies, tens of thousands of German women were implicated in the Holocaust and other Nazi atrocities. There were also Jewish perpetrators, as documented in another recent study by Yevgeny Finkel called Ordinary Jews. As we know, German, Austrian, and Hungarian women, but also Poles, Romanians, and Yugoslavs, were the victims of the widespread incidents of rape, gang rape, and rape murder by Soviet soldiers. The details are unnecessary here, but it's worth emphasizing that the problem of rape continued long after the cessation of hostilities and became a serious obstacle to the successful spread of communist influence in countries and in both Eastern and, by the way, Western Europe too, where they were in born homes. We talked about something, the Danish historian about that today, where Soviet soldiers were stationed. German and Austrian and French and Belgian women were also the victims of rape by Western Allied soldiers. So it's important to underline the fact that the level of violence was much lower than in the Soviet case. Women were also subjects of brutal exploitation in situations of formal and informal prostitution, which should also be seen as a form of violence against females. There was simply no other way for them to eat or feed their children than to sell their bodies for sex in exchange for cans of food, cigarettes as a form of currency, and black market goods. Women were also, and we learned a lot about this today, the object of retribution for what was called collaboration horizontale. That is, having engaged in consensual sexual relations with German soldiers. The consensual part is a very difficult word, and I think needs to be, parsed, but let's call it that for now. Their persecutors were sometimes from resistance groups, but more often than not, they were local men and women who shaved their heads, stripped them bare, sometimes beat them, and painted swastikas on their bodies or clothes. There were no trials except of the most superficial sort. No proof offered. Accusations were frequently enough to condemn the women to the fate of shame and violence. From the descriptions of these events, one gets the distinct feeling that the men involved were themselves compensating for their own lack of agency and ability to resist the Germans, more than they were punishing the alleged collaboration. Some 20,000 women were victims of this kind of violence in more than 50 cities and towns in France and several thousand in Denmark and in Holland. In those countries that suffered more directly under the thumb of the Nazis, Poland, the Czech Protectorate, occupied Soviet territory, there seemed to be less judgmental treatment, although we heard something not completely different today, but needs amendment on my part. Less judgmental treatment of the women who were frequently forced by harsh economic circumstances into sexual relations with German soldiers, or were simply forced by the Germans into sexual relations. In Eastern Europe, collaborators of both sexes, and this is a generalization, but I think it holds, were judged more or less equally. In other words, women were shot if they collaborated, and if not, they were treated the same pretty much as the men. Violence against Jews in the interregnum between war and peace took on a particularly poignant character, given what European Jews had been forced to endure during the war. Anti-Semitism did not decrease with the revelations of Nazi atrocities against the Jews, nor did local populations welcome the surviving Jews back to their homes and businesses from internment, exile, or hiding. Instead, Jews were greeted with derision, hostility, and violence. There were murderous pogroms in Hungary, in Miskolc in July 1946, and in Krumlov in May 1946, and in Poland, in Krakow, in August 1945, and in Kielce, the worst of the bunch, in April 1946. Even Communist Party leaders like Matyas Rákosi in Hungary, who was himself of Jewish origin, and Władysław Gomułka in Poland, who had a Jewish wife and son, fostered anti-Semitism in their comments and by their acts, and did little to hinder widespread violence against Jews. In his terrifying book, Fear, Jan Gross describes bands of Polish Boy Scouts systematically boarding trains, looking for Jews to harass, intimidate, beat, and murder. Estimates of the number of Jews murdered in targeted killings and pogroms in Poland between the end of the war and the summer of 1946 range between 500 and 1,500. Between 1945 and 1948, almost 300,000 Jews fled Eastern Europe to Allied-controlled Germany. They fled to Germany, from Eastern Europe, in good measure as a consequence of ongoing anti-Semitic violence and discrimination. So what can we conclude from this quick sketch of violence during the interregnum? First of all, the borders between war and peace were much more fluid than most scholars have often asserted. One does not easily open the Pandora's box of war without releasing devils and goblins of violence, vengeance and retribution. That is very difficult to put back in that box. Ethnic cleansing, genocide, and civil war frequently accompany war. In fact, almost all the time. Destroying peoples, societies, and social solidarity. Post-war periods, with or without occupations, experienced the repercussions of this violence. Sometimes in the continuation or outbreak of violence itself, sometimes as collective trauma and manifestations of social breakdown. Suicide rate was super high all over Europe right after the end of the war. Alcoholism, rowdyism, and criminality of various sorts. Second, nationalism and anti-Semitism that pervaded World War II and built to a crescendo of mass murder and forced deportation of minority peoples did not simply dissipate once the war was over. One could argue that the force of nationalism only became more robust, reflected in the post-war persecution and expulsion of minorities, including the Jews, from European societies, and the creation of mono-ethnic countries which now insisted, even more so than before the war, on the identity of ethnic nation and state. Something that the leadership, communists, by the way, also adhered to. People sometimes think that communists were anti-nationalists. That's not at all the case. People like Gomułka was one of the most fierce nationalists around, and others as well. German domination had gone, but much about the German ideology and propaganda remained. Third, it's sometimes the case that we get blinded by the sheer destructive force of Nazi ideology and power, and forget that many of the German allied, occupied, and associated countries in the Nazi realm exerted a will of their own and pursued their own exclusionary and extreme nationalist policies during the war that really had very little to do with the Nazis. This goes as well for the governments in exile in London, who are too frequently excused their nationalist excesses. Moreover, we know the Allies had turned their backs on multi-ethnic countries that they themselves had created after World War I, and the pledges of minority rights that had accompanied the peace treaties that they signed. Instead, they bought into the ideas proffered at the 1923 Treaty of Lausanne and were ready to support the expulsion, if orderly and humane, a la Potsdam, of national minorities in the name of supposedly more stable mono-ethnic states. In some ways, I agree with Ys van Dijk, who has written that the biggest change that the war brought to Eastern Europe was the complete disappearance of the Germans and the Jews. Think of interwar Eastern Europe and post-war Eastern Europe, that's the huge, huge change. In the new book, and this is fourth and last, entitled Stalin and the Fate of Europe, that will be published by Harvard in the fall, I've argued that there was a remarkable revival of responsible politics and political leaders after World War II, dedicated to the sovereignty and social welfare of their respective nations. I argue as well that there was more openness to alternative paths of development than is frequently asserted in the historiography. But it took time and effort to cope with the violence that pervaded these countries of Europe. And that which took place against minorities was generally left to play itself out to the political benefit of the ruling elites. They themselves were subject to the same prejudices and the same instincts as their own peoples. I mean, Danish in some ways, reflected the Czechoslovak people, and the Czechoslovak people reflected Danish. I mean, it's not as if he's in a different category. Eventually, the police, the gendarmes, and the courts, institutions of the state, helped bring the violence to the end. But as we know, there are attempts to bury the history of wartime collaboration and post-war revenge-taking, ethnic cleansing, anti-Semitism, and retribution behind the mirage of heroic resistors, the challenges of rebuilding, and gallant national saviors. These have not stood the test of time. The papers we've heard today attest to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We have now some 30 minutes for debate. So, please, the first question or intervention.
I would ask you to speak up a little bit and a little bit harder here. So,
thank you for this great description of the landscape. As a footnote, how would you describe a Nuremberg-like process in discrediting the ideology of National Socialism and contrast it with what didn't happen after 1989? Here in the Czech Republic, we have communists in parliament, but it's unthinkable that you would have Nazi party, I hope it's unthinkable, anywhere in Western Europe. So do you see any use in discrediting an ideology in the way that the Allies tried to do, but of course, in light of the Cold War, abandoned quite soon?
Let me add an addendum to your question, if I might. And that addendum would be that soon after the fall of the Soviet Union, Vladimir Bukovsky and several other people tried to convince Yeltsin to have a Nuremberg process, against the leadership of the Soviet Union. You may recall that the Communist Party was put on trial, and in part to deprive them, of their resources, which they did. They took away the resources of the Communist Party. But he couldn't get a Nuremberg trial set up, and Bukovsky was very bitter about that. I just got an email last night that there's some lawyer, and whether this works or not, I don't know, who has been trying to get materials on Stalinist perpetrators by claiming that he himself was a Stalinist, and has been given a lot of material, by the FSB. And supposedly that material is in an archive which he himself has and is in the West, and I know my colleagues at the Hoover Institution, who have a big archive, as you know, are looking to grab that material. So we'll see what happens. To go to your question about Nuremberg, like most trials of perpetrators, and I've included this, Bosnia, Cambodia, everywhere that we've had these kind of tribunals based on notions of, bringing the senior perpetrators to answer in front of the court. I think in some ways they're good, in some ways they're bad. In some ways they serve the larger purpose of justice and the condemnation, in other words, of Nazism and what it meant. And in some ways they're insufficient. Nuremberg was particularly insufficient, you know, in talking about the mass murder of the Jews, for example. It was totally incidental to what Nuremberg did. This was about aggression at war and war crimes, not about genocide. As you may know, Raphael Lemkin tried to get in, you know, I did some work on Lemkin once, and he tried to stick in there genocide. They just wouldn't have it. They weren't interested. There were other problems as well, which is that they didn't get a lot of them. But there's a reverse side of the coin, which again, I just read this manuscript. I was supposed to write a blurb, you know, I was on the plane, and I'm about 3/4 of the way through, and it's really good, this baby book. He's in Australia. It's going to come out at Cambridge Press, I think, you know, 3 or 4 months. He argues there that the Allies actually did some good in arresting a lot of these alleged Nazis, and particularly, you know, Nazis who might cause trouble in the societies. And some people said they did it just for their own security, but they didn't. It was partly punitive. So they applied punitive justice on their own. So we have to look at Nuremberg. We have to look at the follow-up trials of Nuremberg, of which there were 4 or 5, which were very significant, but not at all played up by Nuremberg. And we have to look at the entire Allied policy towards Nazi criminals, which in the end, you know, is not as bad as I myself had originally thought. So let me leave it at that. It's a good question.
Thank you so much for this panoramic overview. It was insightful indeed. Do you hear me? Yeah?
Yes, yeah.
Great. My name is Valeria Gorobeva. I'm from the Institute of International Studies here. And my question concerns the theoretical frame you are suggesting. I do like the notion of interregnum you are involved in this discussion, but it produces this impression that the whole violence was triggered with the vacuum of power. Is it really the case, or should we distinguish at least between this spontaneous violence, which was driven with this sort of reversal of powerlessness, as you said, and also state-supported violence, which was strategic in a way, like deportation of Poles from the Soviet Union, Operation Wisla, many of those cases? And if it makes sense to distinguish at least between these 2 big groups, how did they correlate with each other? Did they go hand in hand, or did they go in stages or something? Can you please comment on that? Thank you.
I think that's a, you know, a great remark, one which I agree with. It's also true that once Nazi power started to recede, so when Nazi ruled Europe, in some ways there was a measure of order. I mean, it's a terrible order. In the East, it's a murderous order, but it is order. You remember, of course, that the Nazis stopped the pogroms, right, in Ukraine, Lithuania, and Poland, that had broken out, you know, right when Barbarossa had happened. And there were a whole series of pogroms, and they had talked about, well, maybe you guys should, you know, take your own revenge on the Jews as well. And so there's all kinds of nasty stuff, but they found it too disorderly. A little bit like Kristallnacht. You know, remember Kristallnacht? You know, they said to themselves, we can't have this disorder. You know, it doesn't mean they weren't killers, right? But they didn't like disorder of that sort. So similarly in Europe, they had a measure of order. When the communist governments came in, you know, and as I mentioned in the talk in 47 and 48, and they become, you know, in Czechoslovakia, it's easy to date. It's February 1948, you know, where you have then the Stalinist government. The other countries are a little bit difficult, you know, some later, some a little bit earlier. But nevertheless, when a kind of Stalinist government takes control, there's a certain order imposed upon society, which itself is violent, right, and exacts victims, sometimes in the tens of thousands, but nevertheless, you know, within a framework of the state. So the interregnum is in between, and of course you're right, there are states coming. There is the Beneš decrees, you know, that are implemented in Czechoslovakia. There is the forced deportation in Poland that the Polish government's involved in, and it's a kind of mix. If you know from the historiography of the deportations, people talk about the wild period, you know, right after the war, where there really isn't much state control, and then the more state-oriented period. I tend to worry about that distinction in my own work. I think that it's too stark, that it's all wild in some ways. years. You know, there's a lot of spontaneous violence in that second period, which is supposedly under state control. But you're right to say that, you know, the state does insert itself in many of these violent actions, whether it's Axia Wisła or some of the others.
You mentioned at one point that the main result of World War II was the disappearance in Eastern Europe of Germans and Jews, like that. And you seem to accept it. Isn't it a problematic equation? I mean, the Jews were physically exterminated. Germans were deported. Whatever happened. Of course, it was a violent process.
They were gone.
If we put this on an equal basis, doesn't create a bit of wrong image of what actually happened.
Well, I mean, it's clear.
Genocide, ethnic cleansing is.
No, I would never do that. I don't equate them at all. But I mean, but for Eastern Europe, what Eastern Europe looked like, this is what I was trying to say, before the Second World War versus what it looked like after the Second World War. The kinds of, especially urban life, you know, Prague. You know, it was a completely different city in terms of its content. Right? Warsaw, I mean, my God. You know, it's a totally different city in terms of its content. That's the argument. I mean, I wouldn't really dream of equating the two, and I've written about the differences between genocide and ethnic cleansing, and one does bleed into the other. I mean, Germans were killed in the expulsions, but that's not what I was trying to imply at all, and I think Georg, who wrote that, would never dream of saying something like that either. So it's just a linguistic matter, I think, versus a substantive.
Yeah, I would perhaps stress one more factor of these elements that go into this policy of ethnic cleansing and violence, and that's the economy. There was a pretty good book a couple of years ago, The Economy of Ethnic Cleansing, by Gerlach, I think, from St. Peter University, who looked at Czechoslovakia, actually, and highlights the factor that really sometimes gets underrated, how important the economic incentive was for such a huge population movement. Like, so if one thinks about it, that within a few years, like territories with 5, 6, 7 million people were repopulated to a large extent, all this is not understandable if one doesn't see how much loot, in essence, was available, how many opportunities, economic opportunities for people that now were offered free or relatively free opportunities in these often relatively advanced areas compared to where the new sector came from.
I mean, I agree completely. And if I had another 20 minutes, I would have probably talked about economic motivations too, and not just for ethnic cleansing, but also for genocide. I mean, some of the most recent research, you know, has demonstrated, for example, there's this guy here who wrote a book on the economics of the Holocaust. Anyways, demonstrated that the German food ministry associated with the military, it's a military food ministry, you know, is essentially calling for the elimination of the Jews in order to get their property. I mean, it's, you know, it's a kind of one-to-one relationship between their need for finances and their need for resources and the Jews' property. You know, we see this as well, by the way, in new research on the Armenian Genocide, where, you know, the Turkish government, you know, is looking for money from Armenians, who they also think, like the Germans think, are enormously wealthy. And so they're looking for, and, you know, discussions. I mean, there are awful discussions between Morgenthau, the American ambassador, and Talat Pasha about the Armenian genocide. And Talat says, you know, we want the insurance policies of all those Armenians who died. You know, we want to collect the insurance. You know, they all have insurance policies in the United States. So in genocide too, and in Gross's work, if you've read any of it, and you should, you know, especially the last several books, has really talked about greed. You know, and the role of greed, simple, old-fashioned greed. I mean, these Polish peasants don't really hate the Jews, and even sometimes aren't anti-Semitic, in quotes, but they want their houses, and they want their property, and they want their businesses. And so when they come back, you know, they take potshots at them and kill them and chase them off and engage in pogroms and that kind of thing because of the simple, good old-fashioned greed. I mean, leave anti-Semitism aside, that's part of the story too, obviously. But it's greed. So, absolutely, and with the ethnic cleansing policies, it's clear that the Polish government, you know, I mean, Gomulka says as much, many different ways, many different times. You know, he was minister of the reclaimed territories, or the re-won territories, or whatever, in Ciscania. You know, he says many times that land needs to belong to us, not to the Germans. We want the Germans out of here, and we want that land to develop ourselves, and we want those cities to develop ourselves. For our purposes, we need it. I mean, there's some argument, remember, the Poles lost the East to the Soviet Union. So the argument is always couched in those terms, not couched in those terms, but subliminally couched in those terms. You know, they took away our stuff in the East, and we'll take away the stuff in the West.
I just want to connect to these last two comments because I did research on a small town in Hungary, which is called Budakeszi. And there were about 100 Jews and about 4,000 Germans living there. And first, during the Holocaust, the Jews were taken away, then about 3,500 Germans were relocated, and the local population got everything from them. So yeah, the economic aspect was very strong, and also the aspect that from Hungary, basically 200,000 Germans were relocated, and about 500,000 Jews died during the Holocaust. And that means that basically the entire middle class of Hungary disappeared. And on the short term, it was a very beneficial economic kind of process, I would say. But on the long term, the middle class was missing. So that's also another aspect of this whole thing.
No, absolutely. And that's actually a really good answer to your, whatever question it was. Yeah, your question about Germans and Jews. You know, you're missing a whole middle class in many of these countries. You know, people who, you know, were used traditionally, you know, to dealing with various kinds of parts of economic and capitalist development.
And also it was very striking how the administrative aspect was the same, both for the Jews and for the Germans. So I guess they kind of developed this process during the Holocaust and then used it again when the Germans were taken away. And there was even one institution handling the so-called abandoned property, both for Jews and for Germans.
And I don't know if you know, the Arrow Cross was also involved in the same Arrow Cross guys, you know, who killed Jews and deported them, were involved with the Germans. Exactly the same guys. You know, they knew how to pull people out of their homes and put them on trains or take them to places where they needed to go, and they were used by the post-war Hungarian government to, you know, to get the Germans as well. No, absolutely. It's a terrible piece of European history and a terrible piece of world history that we see, and the continuities are real. I mean, the continuities are real. The same camps. You know, in Poland especially, the camps where the Germans were put, I don't know much about the camps in the Czech lands, but in Poland the camps were, you know, the same camps where Jews were. They're emptied out of Jews and then they're put Germans in.
Sorry to ask a second question, but
that's good. That's
growing
good.
up.
So listen, the thread is, I always threaten my students, you know, if you don't ask questions, I can lecture more.
And well, that's good.
And we want to eat. So.
If you could say quite a bit more on nationalism. Because you both, the more I think about what you said, the more pessimistic I become. But it seems to me that Poland and the Czechs have sort of settled their border issue. But the Hungarians obviously are still unhappy because they have lots of Hungarians living in Slovakia and all over the place, and they probably lost a great deal in Versailles, much more so than any other time. Well, I don't want to make a generalization. They lost quite a bit. So let me ask you a simple question. How permanent do you think the borders of Europe are? And given that many of the national feelings, because of the departure of Germans and Jews, have maybe been made even more strong by some of the relocations after World War II.
I'm sorry, I didn't get that last one.
Well, I just wonder whether the national animosities that are bottled up now might explode with greater force. We've seen it in Hungary, for example, the attitude to some of the refugees from the Middle East. So I just wondered what your assessment is of what is in store.
I mean, there are a lot of different things to say. One of them is there's no reason to be an optimist. I mean, there's absolutely no reason. I mean, I've been doing this work now for 50 years, in various ways, and I'm a happy person. I love my kids and my wife, and I have a great family and friends. I love California. The sun's great. I recommend it to you. But in terms of historical stuff goes, there's no reason to think somehow, that these conflicts are settled. With that said, I mean, I've known Hungarians. I have Hungarian friends who have maps of Greater Hungary, but they've had them for decades. They've had them actually since the First World War. It's just part of their living room. The Greater Hungary. And if you travel with Hungarians, I mean, some of you may be Hungarian, right? You travel with Hungarians along the Atlantic, and they'll say, "This was Hungary. It should be again." And, so it's a little bit. I'm not sure how dangerous it is. I mean, it's not good that people think that that's Hungary, right? Maybe it's like Mexicans think that California really belongs to Mexico, or Spain really thinks that all the New World should be. It's not, I don't see any immediate danger. The Second World War was a danger. And as I said, Hungarians and Romanians especially, would have strangled each other to death, if they could have. They would have taken each other apart. If allowed to do so in Hitler's Europe, and they weren't. And then the communists took over, so they had to stop. Right? So I'm not sure that that's a problem. Borders, are interesting with Crimea, of course. That became a dangerous precedent. And I don't think Putin is right to equate what happened in Kosovo, with what happened in Crimea. It's a different kind of situation, but the land grab in Crimea is really nerve-wracking, I think, for many Europeans, especially in Eastern Europe, which is a little closer, right, to Moscow, in terms of what may happen next. And there, I think, one just has to be wary and careful. Nationalism. Let me just say 2 words about nationalism. Again, I've been doing this work for a long time, and nationalism is a force in modern society, European history, and beyond Europe now. I mean, anybody who's been to China recently or talked to Chinese about their, issues and the kind of terrible 19th century when they were taking advantage of it. That's not going to happen anymore, and we're going to show you. So nationalism is not something that just belongs to Europeans, right? It's all over the world, and it's an incredibly powerful force. It reaches something in human beings And you and I too, I mean, because we can't exempt ourselves from the race, right? I mean, we're all part of human beings. It reaches something, especially in times of crisis or economic want or war. It reaches something in human beings that impel them to do things I think they wouldn't otherwise do. So it's a terribly dangerous force. You know, and when our president, I won't talk about your countries, and I've done that critically already, let me talk about my country critically. You know, when our president says I'm an American nationalist, there's nothing wrong with that. Not a patriot, but a nationalist. You know, that's really dangerous stuff. You know, because it in some ways changes the complexion of how the United States thinks about its own nationhood and its own role. So that nationalism is, you know, and it keeps coming. And it, you know, since the end of the 19th century, it wasn't always a bad force. So we can hope that they're positive nationalism, and there is such a thing as liberal nationalism, right? There is such a thing as social democrats who are nationalists. You know, nationalism originated in very positive ways. You know, all these wonderful little peoples, you know, Herder and all these little flowers under the sun, you know, the Estonians, you know, all these people, you know, deserve their role, deserve their place on earth. Well, I think that's, you know, that's positive. But, you know, by the end of the 19th century, this kind of racist element never, you know, didn't get removed from nationalism. That's why it's crazy in the American case, especially. But it's also crazy in other cases, too.
Coming back to your conclusion, I think there's the question has to be raised. What time, or if ever, did we Europeans, especially in Central Europe, succeed in overcoming the results of the war? To what extent, or what time, by what, and if even we succeeded to overcome the results of the war?
I don't think it happened. I don't think it's overcome yet. You know, again, Tony Judd's big book, Post-War, you know, kind of has a post-war and then a post-post-war, and that he argues after 1989, Eastern Europe will be entering a new world of self-consciousness about the war, and that the post-war and post-war will end. But remember, that book was written, and I knew him pretty well, under the influence, first of all, of 1989, and the tremendous idealism and sense of purpose, also under the influence of the positive visage of the European Union, which within the last 3 or 4 years especially, you know, has kind of tumbled in Europe itself. And with those things happening, you know, these societies remain enormously susceptible to, as I said in the paper, mirages about what happened in the war. I mean, you know as well as I do, some of you do too, that the World War II Museum, you know, in Gdańsk was built. Fabulous museum. Fabulous museum. You know, done by a really first-rate historian. You know, came under fire from the Polish government for not being patriotic enough, not being nationalist enough. Changing the exhibitions, they already changed the film at the end of the, you know, at the thing. What this means is that people have not come to terms with the war. You know, the Poles have a hell of a time, you know, with the fact of being perpetrators as well as victims. They just haven't been able to do it yet. I mean, I don't blame them necessarily. It's not their fault. You know, there was a tough go in World War II. You know, they got clobbered. They fought valiantly, but they haven't overcome that. You know, then you go to the, you know, to the Warsaw Uprising Museum, and it's just pure patriotic nationalist gobbledygook. You know? And that's why it's so nice to be among a group, you know, of younger historians, you know, who are dedicated to trying to get these stories straight. And I believe history has a role in doing this, and the historians have a role, and that it will change things eventually. think they're changed yet. And I think governments are, you know, especially now. And again, I don't exempt our own government, you know, from this. The governments, we have our own problems. There are different kinds of problems. It's not about memory of World War II. But in Europe, the memory of World War II feeds into these other problems. It's easily accessible by politicians. You know, in our country, you talk about World War II, people, they don't even know what it is. I mean, that's the sad truth. But maybe it's for the best. You know, that they simply have forgotten everything. You know, since 20.
You don't believe that.
What?
You don't believe that. It's
Not completely. Not completely, but a lot of it. A lot of it. Anyway, the point is that I think the post-war is not over in Europe, and that just, you know, influenced again by '89 and by European Union, was excessively optimistic in that book about coming to terms. But you recall, in the end of it, he says it's just at the end of the book. You know, he's kind of, you write this terrible book, not terrible, good book about all these terrible things, and then you end up by saying, well, I'm optimistic. This will happen. It didn't happen.
Well, yeah, time maybe for last question or last remark. If not, I think your last comment was a very good comment for the end of today's discussion. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming. Now we will meet I think the direct people taking part on the conference will meet directly behind this door. We will go together to the place of our dinner. Tomorrow we will start a bit later than it was planned, at 9:20, because one of the colleagues couldn't unfortunately come, so we have a bit more time and use this for starting later. And
but 9:20 means 9:20.
Yeah. It was a great. So this is from our German colleague, of course. Tomorrow 9:20 for everybody, you know. Thank you very much and have a nice evening.